I want to tell you a story about the Crusades and the Enlightenment and religious toleration in Europe. It's probably going to take me 8 or 9 minutes, and then I promise at some point this will connect into the readings in Jesus. So hold on, I'm not just waxing poetic up here. Christianity began under persecution. Peter and Paul were killed by the Roman emperor. And for 300 years, it was illegal to be a Christian. Variously enforced in different parts of the empire, but a lot of times Christians were killed. We have so many early Roman martyrs. But Christians lived their faith so well, loving God and loving neighbor, allowing themselves to be killed for their faith without vengeance or retribution, that by 313 AD, the Emperor Constantine legalizes Christianity. And Christianity had already spread significantly across the empire, but once it was legal, it spread even more so. To the point that by the 500s, 600s AD, the entire Roman Empire was majority Christian. That was all of the Mediterranean world, and then a little bit up into Europe, and a little bit over into the Middle East, but certainly North Africa, Greece, Spain, Italy, the Levant, all of that was Christian. The tendency of Christians, generally, was toward religious coexistence, we should say. We were killed for our faith for 300 years, so in the early years of Christianity, post-legalization, it wasn't really our style to say, yeah, let's kill other people for their religion. It wasn't really, in the historical memory, not something that we did. And yet, over the course of European history, you see different reform movements in Christianity, which get less and less tolerant of dissent. Especially around the 1000s AD, you see a lot more of the killing heretics that you get reamed about by the secular press all the time. That did happen, and it happened in a specific point of European history. But I want you to understand why. And the reason that became more and more of a thing is because for a millennium, from the early 600s AD until the late 1600s AD, Europe felt like it was about to be wiped off the map. They experienced their existence as threatened, that the culture and the faith was going to be completely exterminated. What happened? Well, again, picture the Roman Empire. You have 4 original primatial sees, the 4 most important cities in Christianity. The apostolic sees, if you will. They're Rome, Peter and Paul died. Antioch, where Peter also started the church. Jerusalem, where Jesus died, but also the Apostle James. And Alexandria, where people say the gospel writer Mark began the church. But those 4 cities were the main Christian cities. And then you add to that Constantinople, although the Latin Christians will say, well, Constantinople added itself, all right? It's not as ancient as the other 4. But nonetheless, you have Rome, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. Okay, here's what happens. In 630 AD, this guy named Muhammad comes with an army and conquers the city of Mecca. A couple decades before, he had been kicked out of Mecca. He was preaching this new religion. He was talking about this Quran thing. They didn't like it very much, so they kicked him out. He went to Medina, convinced those people of his new religion, raised an army, and then took that army back to the city that exiled him and said, hey, I've conquered you now, you are going to be Muslim. But that impulse didn't stop at Mecca. He kept going. And the brief research I did, and if it's wrong, please correct me in email later, I'll see it in 2 months, suggests that Muhammad took Mecca in 630 AD. But very, very quickly, the major Christian cities fell to the Muslim armies. Damascus, not a primatial see, but the capital of Syria, a very important city, fell in 634 AD. Antioch, again, one of the most important Christian cities, fell in 637 AD. Jerusalem in 638, and Alexandria in 641. Over the course of 4 years, 637 to 641, 3 of the 4 primatial sees fell to Muslim armies. Rome had fallen 200 years earlier to the Visigoths, the barbarians at the gates, if you will, but they managed to say loosely Christian. But this was something completely different. So 3/4 of Christianity, or 3/5 if you count Constantinople, wiped out in 4 years. Not wiped out, those people aren't killed necessarily, but they're under the dominion of a non-Christian state and a non-Christian ruler. And those Muslim armies didn't stop, they kept going. They took North Africa, they took Carthage in 698 AD. That was the most important city in North Africa. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain in 711 AD. And they took Toledo, the capital of Roman and then Visigoth Spain, in 712 AD. So from 630 AD, when Muhammad took Mecca, until 712 AD, most of the Roman Empire was taken by Muslim armies. That's a big deal. And imagine sitting in Italy, sitting in Rome or Greece, watching Jerusalem fall, Antioch, which is eastern Turkey, Antioch fall, Constantinople's barely hanging on, you watch Spain fall. Suddenly you think the entire continent is under threat, that the entire continent is going to be wiped out, that these armies are going to keep going because nothing has slowed them down yet. They're going to push you into France, they're going to push you into the UK, and they're going to push you into the ocean. You're going to be done. That was European mindset by the early 700s AD. Things slow down for about 300 years, and then the Europeans are, to use modern parlance, triggered. The pilgrims going to Jerusalem begin to be killed and harassed. And the Europeans say, okay, this is enough. You took these lands 300 years ago. We're still a little steamed up about that. We're not super happy that all these historically Christian lands are now dominated by the Muslim armies. But, okay, as long as the pilgrims can get to Jerusalem, we might be okay. But then the pilgrims are restricted from Jerusalem. You can't get to the Holy Land. And so the Europeans say, this can't stand anymore. The emperor in Constantinople is asking for help. The pilgrims are dying. We're going to try to take these lands back. So that's what we call the Crusades. And they tried to take back the Christian lands. And they were somewhat successful. In Spain, they took Toledo back in 1085. They took Antioch in 1098, and they took Jerusalem in 1099. So two branches kind of coming out from Europe again, going back into these historically Christian lands. It was successful in Spain. So from 1085 in Toledo, it keeps going further south and further south until in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella take Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. And then suddenly, Spain is under Christian control again for the first time in 800 years. In the Middle East, less successful. The Crusaders lose Jerusalem only 100 years later in 1187, and they lose Antioch 200 years later in 1268. And at that point, it's sort of status quo again. And then the Ottomans come on the scene, and they push further than they've ever pushed before. They take, to the great amazement of Europe, and they never thought this was ever going to be possible, they take Constantinople, the new head of the Roman Empire, truly the legal continuation of Rome. Julius Caesar, all the way to Constantinople, is an unbroken line. I mean, emperors are killed and they die and whatever, but generally it's an unbroken line. From the fall of Rome in 400 to 1453. But in 1453, the Muslim armies take Constantinople and they keep going. They take Athens in 1458. Plato, Aristotle, democracy, the cradle of Western civilization. Wiped out, gone, 1458. Greece is gone. Hungary and Poland hold the line for about 200 years, but the Ottomans continue to advance. They take Belgrade in 1521, and they take Budapest in 1541. This is the high point of the Ottoman Empire, and Europe is terrified. They're terrified that, again, they're going to be pushed into the sea and wiped off the map. There's nowhere for them to go. This is right before, right, they take Budapest right after we know about the New World. So in a sense, there's a place you can escape to, but still, Europe is Europe, and they feel that pressure. And they felt that pressure for 1,000 years. And the fever only breaks in 1683, which we kind of consider as the modern era. We don't think of it lasting that long. 1683. The Ottoman Empire gets as far as it ever got. It gets to Vienna, and it surrounds Vienna. Vienna is the capital of the Austrian Empire, one of the most important and most widespread European powers. Vienna is about to fall. The Poles, the Hungarians, they come in, they defend, well, the Hungarians were sort of under occupation at that point, but the Poles especially, they come in, they defend Vienna in 1683. The Ottomans are repulsed, and then it's a slow decline for the Ottomans until World War I, when their empire is dissolved. Very long history lesson, but I want you to take away from this liberty, toleration. It's a luxury belief. It's one of those things that we aspire to, but when we feel threatened, it gets shut down. And you see it in European history. In the 600 years from Christ until Antioch falls, you have a lot of general religious toleration. Not universal, but general. Then, suddenly, existence is threatened, and you see a lot more, wow, religious dissent is a threat. It's like opening the gates to the Muslim invaders. We're not going to do that. And so any kind of heresy, any kind of dissent is shut down immediately. And as the centuries go on, usually with violence and usually with death. And then the Enlightenment comes on the scene. And the story I was told in school was, well, Europe finally woke up, realized it hated God, and then everybody was free. Such a lie. Such a lie. It's not how the Enlightenment happened, right? It happened because this existential threat to Europe finally faded away. By 1683, when the Ottomans were repulsed, the Europeans were also masters of the seas. Reference the Battle of Lepanto, if you'd like, to figure out how that happened. They are able to go beyond Europe, so they have these colonies in the New World and in Africa. They don't feel as threatened anymore. Suddenly, they are in control. They're in control of their destiny. And once they feel like they're in control, then they feel like, well, now it's not as much of a threat to have an open marketplace of ideas, to discuss things openly and clearly, to have religious debate. Some people will say it started with the Catholics versus Protestants, and the German princes basically glaring at each other over their little provinces and saying, I guess you can be Catholic if you have to. But there was very little religious toleration within those states. It just didn't happen. But 1683, Europe feels in control of its own destiny, and then we have this idea of, well, there's just all this freedom. Okay, at some point I got to talk about Jesus. Let's do that now. When you feel safe, you are a lot more patient, you're a lot more loving, you're a lot more kind, you're a lot more tolerant. When you feel threatened, when you feel like there are always invading forces on your border, ready to continue to expand and wipe you off the map, whatever those forces are, emotional forces, personal forces, spiritual forces, whatever they are, you're going to lock down. You're going to try to grab control back. Which brings us to the Lord. Our first reading is fascinating. Fascinating. Because it talks about God doesn't have to do stuff because he's in control. It says, there is no God besides you who have the care of all. That you need show you have not unjustly condemned. Basically, God doesn't have to prove anything to anybody because he knows that he's in control. He's the only God. We know he's the only God. He doesn't have to prove anything to anybody. And it goes on and says other things like that. For your might is the source of justice. Your mastery over all things makes you lenient to all. Because God is the master of all things, he's not threatened by anything. So think about yourself. When you're not threatened, you can be patient and tolerant, and you can be kind. You can be open to people around you. When you're threatened, you close down, you get controlling, you get vicious. God is in control of all things. God is master of all things. So if we take our experience as people, expand it to him, multiply by his infinity and eternity, then suddenly God can be the most lenient of all people, the most tolerant of all people. He can make the most space because there's nothing that threatens him. He's threatened by nothing. Wisdom goes on, you show your might when the perfection of your power is disbelieved. So sometimes God does have to show his might because we don't actually trust that he's there or that he cares for us. But generally, his impulse is to be lenient and merciful because he can, because he has the freedom to do so. And that's where we go with our gospel. Why does God not pull up the weeds? He doesn't have to. He doesn't have to. In the parable, the kind of implication is, well, the weeds aren't actually threatening the wheat. That's why a farmer would normally pull them up, because they're pulling resources from the soil. They're stealing water. But this farmer, for whatever reason, not threatened. They're not hurting anybody. Just leave them. He also knows they're not going to threaten the harvest. That somehow he has the ability, when they mature, to differentiate between the weeds and the wheat, to pull them appropriately. Some biblical scholars will say that it's because
the type of weed being talked about here and the type of wheat being talked about, they look very similar when they're growing up, but once they go to fruit, they look very different. So the farmer wanted to wait until it was obvious which were weeds and which were wheat so that he pulled the right ones. But nonetheless, he wasn't threatened by them. So he's like, fine, just leave them. Because at the end, at the harvest, it's all going to be taken care of. And I would say that about the Lord in your life today. You might wonder, you might question, you might even condemn God for why he allows evil and good to coexist. Why is he doing that? Why is he allowing suffering to happen? Why do I suffer? Why does he let this person sin against me? Or why does he let this person sin in a way that hurts themselves? Why does God let the weeds continue? I want to live in a field that's just wheat. I don't want to deal with these weeds anymore. Get rid of them. Why is he so lenient? There are two classic answers to the problem of evil. Moral evil, physical evil. Those are the two evils we experience. Moral evil is evil committed by people. Physical evil is this world not working the way we want it to, and so a hurricane might kill somebody or somebody might get cancer, something like that. God allows physical evil because he has laws and rules that make the universe make sense. If he overrode the laws of the universe every time it would inconvenience somebody or cause suffering, then this universe would be irrational. There would be no science, there would be no sanity, because there would be no pattern at all. Everything would be changing all the time and we wouldn't know why. He allows physical evil for the sake of rationality. And he allows moral evil because if he were to override that, he's overriding your free will. He's making you into a robot, an automaton. You can't love if you can't choose to love. If you're forced to love, that's not love, that's programming. But he's not threatened by that the way we feel threatened by that. He can allow physical evil. He can allow moral evil because he is in control of all things. And because he's in control of all things, he knows that he can always bring good from evil. We try to avoid, and I really hate the language of God always has a plan, because God's plan is not that a child should die, or that somebody should die of cancer, or that we should be sinning against each other. That's not his plan. I don't like it. God doesn't want evil, but he allows it because he's not threatened by it, because if evil happens, if you suffer, if somebody does wrong, God is so powerful, he's so omnipotent, he's so in control that he can bring good from that evil. I've seen somebody who suffers mightily in their body become a saint. Because in that suffering, they offered that suffering up with Jesus on the cross and they became so deeply Christ-like. God doesn't want the suffering. He doesn't introduce the evil, but he's not threatened by it because he knows that he can take that evil and bring incredible good from it. Same is true with sin. He doesn't want you to sin. He doesn't want me to sin. He doesn't want you to experience the effects of sin, but he's not threatened by it. Because when people sin, we become more Christ-like. Jesus was innocent on the cross. When sin puts us on the cross, it just makes us like Jesus. And also, sinners are desperately in need of their God. And God can work with the worst sinners to bring the most beautiful conversions. God can show us the power of his salvation in the lives of the most abhorrent people. God is not threatened by evil. He doesn't have to be. He's in control. God cannot be wiped off the map. And so I would challenge you tonight similarly. Do you believe in the sovereignty of God? Do you believe that God is in control? Do you live your life feeling constantly threatened? Like you're going to be wiped off the map. Like somebody is going to sin against you and it's all going to fall apart. That if you reach one more level of suffering, that's it, you're done. Are you constantly feeling threatened? If you are, it's going to be hard for you to be virtuous. It's going to be hard for you to be loving. It's going to be hard for you to be open to what God wants to do and what other people are doing. But if you believe in God, if you trust in the Lord, and especially his power and his might and his sovereignty, if you believe that God is the creator of all things, and because of that he has the freedom to be lenient, then you never have to worry again. You can leave your worries at the door. You can give up the control that you're holding because you feel threatened. Give it up to God. Put it in his hands. The hands that made the universe and that still guide the universe. Trust in the Lord. And then you will never, ever feel threatened because you know that God loves you. And you know that God is good. And you know that God is going to bring incredible graces from whatever you face next.